So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good night. I don't know where you are located. Many of you are online to follow this session. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you for this session that is dedicated to measuring impact, trade-offs, and accountability. I will chair this session, and I will co-share this session with Georgina Kamp, that is located in Australia, and that should arrive soon, I hope. I don't see Georgina connected yet. She will arrive very soon. Maybe I will start with some rules of the game for everybody to know how we will manage this session. So first of all, we've got 5 papers that will be presented. Every speaker will have 10 minutes to present. And then we will manage to have at the end of the session 20 to 25 minutes to collect questions and to interact at the end of all the presentation. Okay. So if you want to ask questions, you go through the chat. Or obviously, if you are in the room, you can raise your hand at the end of the presentations and we can collect your question directly. So that's it for the rules of the game. So I'm Stéphane Saucier. I'm very happy to share this session. I mean, I worked for now more than 15 years on public procurement issue, and especially on contractual issues, thinking about how to write contract with service providers, how to write secured contracts, flexible enough contracts to take into account an expected event like COVID-19 or something else, how to give the right incentives to service providers. And I was stunned by the keynote we had yesterday by Joe Stiglitz. I thought it was a very interesting keynote, very amazing keynote. And what Joe told us yesterday is that as long as you cannot measure performance, maybe you should not contract out public services to for-profit companies and even to non-for-profit company, because they will follow their own objectives, and because you were not able to measure exactly what you want, you should not contract out, or maybe you should contract out, but using cost-plus contract instead of outcome-based contracts. And this is very interesting because this session is about measuring impact, measuring social impact. So it's even more difficult when you are dealing with social impact to measure this. So how could you measure that? How could you prove that you've got some impact? How can you find some causality between what you wrote within the contract and the results you observe? All those questions are fascinating. And I'm really waiting for this session to have some element of answers. So I do not want to put too much pressure to the participants and to the speakers, but really I believe that this session will be very helpful to go beyond what have been said yesterday. So that's it for my introduction. We've got an amazing panel today. We've got 5 speakers. We will deal with issue concerning measurement, of course, but also with issue concerning qualitative assessment of social impact, not only quantitative assessments. And we will also discuss about tools that can be used in order to measure impact. And I know that Georgina, so that is co-chairing this session. Is Georgina online or not? Maybe? Not yet. So Georgina is a perfect co-chair when she is here, because she worked for many years on developing tools to measure impact. So it would have been very interesting to have her introduce the session also, but obviously this is not possible. So I propose to start right now the session, Mehdi. Mehdi and Nigel are the two captains of the session, and for every technical issue they should step in. So is Liv already in? So she's connected. So let's start by the first presentation that will be given by Liv Van Leu from the South African Medical Council, and she will present a very interesting case study about one social impact bonds. Liv, the floor is yours. You've got 10 minutes, no more. So you are muted. Yes, now we can hear you.
Yes. Okay, good morning, everyone. So my name is Liv Van Leu, working for the South African Medical Research Council on the Imagine Social Impact Bond. So my presentation is looking at how we determined outcomes and set targets while balancing the counterfactual risk in the Imagine Social Impact Bond. So my co-authors and colleagues, Dr. Neveline Slingers, she is in this session as well. Unfortunately, Michelle Stewart, Marita De Vos, and Dr. Abdullah could not be here today. Next slide, please. So the Imagine Social Impact Bond is a comprehensive school-based program that was developed including sexual and reproductive health services to improve outcomes for adolescent girls and young women by empowering them through behavior change interventions and access to treatment and care. This program is about to start in October 2021, will run until December 2024. We aim to reach 5,800 young girls per year in 14 schools in 2 sub-districts in South Africa. And this will be delivered via a social impact bond that mobilizes social investment to provide working capital, and it pays out on successful achievement of pre-agreed HIV and pregnancy outcomes in this target population. Working capital will be provided by the social investor, and outcomes funding is committed by the South African Department of Science and Technology. And as you will see at the bottom of the slide, our stakeholders include Department of Basic Education, Department of Science and Innovation, and the Department of Health. Next slide, please. So when designing the metrics for Imagine, these metrics needed to be feasible and appropriate. But at the same time, they had to satisfy a multitude of stakeholders, and this was quite difficult to negotiate. They had to satisfy the social investor, the outcomes funder, the various stakeholders in the South African government, such as Department of Basic Education, Department of Health, but they also had to be feasible for the implementer. So that was quite a difficult negotiation to please and to satisfy all these stakeholders. Next slide. We developed 3 levels of metrics. So the first level would be the payment mechanisms. These are the outputs and proxy outcomes that will be measured and tracked quarterly that will trigger the outcome payments. So these were the most important for the social investor and the outcomes funder. They will be verified by an independent verification agent. Secondly, there's key performance indicators, which is management information tracked and reported quarterly that has an expected minimum level of performance. This will be managed by a performance manager with the purpose of these KPIs will give an indication of when outputs and outcomes are not being achieved in time so that the program can be adapted to improve performance towards the outcomes. So these KPIs are quite important for the implementer. And then there's the SIB evaluation, which will be conducted by an evaluation team at the SAMRC. So that's data collected to evaluate the effectiveness and the efficiency of the intervention, the financial mechanism, and the SIB model in the South African context. Next slide, please. So then to come to the counterfactual risk, in setting all these metrics, once we had decided on the level of metrics and the indicators that we would use, the next difficulty we found was the counterfactual risk. Because now we've set these indicators, and in the South African context, we found that we don't have accurate data for this particular target group, which is girls in school between the age of 15 to 19 years old in these 2 specific sub-districts. So that created a counterfactual risk for both the outcomes funder and the investor. So generated by not having an accurate assessment of what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. So this risk was deemed high and could lead to outcomes being overvalued or undervalued. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of the level of data we were looking at, again, for 15 to 19-year-old girls in 2 specific sub-districts in South Africa. There's the outcome, these are both outcome indicators and contextual indicators that have an impact on the outcome indicators, such as HIV prevalence, the proportion of HIV positive girls that have started on treatment, the rate of unplanned pregnancy, the proportion of the pregnant girls that are attending antenatal care before 20 weeks. So a lot of that data is already available in South Africa on a national level, on a provincial level, and mostly also on a district level, but then for 15 to 24-year-olds. So not, which is still quite different from 15 to 19-year-olds. And then the really hairy indicators, use of hormonal contraceptives in this age group, the use of pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP. That's already a lot harder to come by. And then the most hairy of them all is the rate of sexual activity. So that kind of data is very hard to come by, but we needed it because it has an impact on how many girls will be interested in contraceptives and pre-exposure prophylaxis. And we need that information to be able to set a target. Next slide, please. So then how did we handle that counterfactual risk? By commissioning research, by spreading the risk between outputs and outcomes, by due diligence process by the investor and outcomes funder, the baseline study, and the PMC, which is a project management committee. Next slide, please. So commissioned research, we are the South African Medical Research Council. So we took about, I think, 2 years to commission research, including 7 original studies, a systematic review, 3 reviews of official health data, and 2 evaluations of similar programs. With the aim of, 1, better understanding the challenges of adolescent girls and young women aged 15 to 19 years old in school, and 2, to develop and test interventions for this target population, and 3, to inform the counterfactual against which targets would be set. The results of this research then inform the program's theory of change and the counterfactual for both contextual and outcomes indicators. Next slide. So it resulted in this quite extensive theory of change. And next slide. And also in setting the counterfactual for these contextual and outcomes indicators. As you will see, the counterfactual was set based on information from the commissioned research, but also national data that is available, which was then disaggregated for this particular age group. Next slide, please. And against those baselines or counterfactual, we were then able to set targets for performance targets for the program. Next slide. So secondly, we spread the risk between outputs and outcomes. You see we have 3 outputs, 4 outcomes, altogether 7 outputs and outcomes against which payment would be made. So the outputs are not dependent on the counterfactual, whereas the outcomes are. In the case that 1 or 2 of these outcomes, it turns out that the counterfactual was quite far off. It won't affect all the achievement of and performance of results, and it won't affect all the payments as the risk is now spread over these 7 indicators.
You've got 1 minute to conclude.
Okay, next slide, please. Scientific review, there was a comprehensive due diligence process by both investor and outcomes fund. So they reviewed the data, the sources that informed the counterfactual, they reviewed the entire program, and they have reviewed the financial model. Next slide. Sorry, I'm just rushing through this now. There will also be a baseline study. At the start of the program, there will be a cross-sectional survey that will produce baseline rates for these indicators, outcome and contextual indicators, and a second survey then 2 years later to compare. Next slide. And then lastly, the project management committee. So the project management committee includes representatives of the social investor, and they will be monitoring performance towards targets. They will also be discussing the baseline studies, and if there is quite a big difference in the counterfactual, they will discuss if that needs to lead to a change in the targets or whatever the consequences might be. That will be discussed in the project management committee together with social investor and the outcomes funder. So in conclusion, next slide. Just to say that as a case study, it's quite complicated and complex to develop these metric systems, especially in a country as South Africa, where data is not that readily available, which leaves you with a very high counterfactual risk. But we've developed some practical ways to counter this counterfactual risk, and we'll see in the next in the next 6 months to 12 months how that will pan out and if we are successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for this presentation. You already had some questions in the chat, so do not hesitate if you want to ask questions directly through the chat. We will collect everything at the end, as I said at the beginning of the session. Let's switch to the second presentation. James, you will talk about qualitative impact protocol and the way to assess impact qualitatively. So the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. The question I'm going to address is, as investors with social goals in mind, how do we know that we're achieving what we think we are? So I'm going to pitch this at a very general level. That raises the question, what would have happened to a particular user group if we hadn't made our investment, we hadn't intervened? And this is a question that I've engaged with as an academic over more than 30 years. We can call it attribution. We can talk about input and output additionality. We can talk about counterfactuals. We can talk about mechanisms. We can try and hide the awkward nature of this question and move on quickly if we're trying to convince other stakeholders. So that's the question I want to address. And I'm going to strip this presentation down and talk about one approach that we've been using to generate additional data points through which we can be more confident about our answer to that question. So if we skip a few slides forward. So this is a story. I was approached by some former students working for non-government organizations nearly 10 years ago now. They were being challenged by the UK Department for International Development to generate better evidence that they were achieving what they were claiming in terms of promoting resilient livelihoods in Malawi and Ethiopia. A very complex context with lots of noise, lots of different causal variables going on. And we secured some money, an academic research grant from the UK government to pilot a qualitative impact evaluation tool called the QUIP. And we did that. We went through 2 rounds of testing it. And this was at the time that the randomista bubble was taking off. And we were interested in the balance between the quantitative measurement of change and the qualitative inferences we make about causation. So that was the academic background to this work. We completed the research, we wrote it up. And then my research officer, and this is a lesson, you choose your research officer as well. She said, right now we've finished the beginning, we've got to move on to the main course. And the main course I discovered was setting up a non-profit company as a spin-off from the university as a device for doing action research into commercially testing what we'd done with a nice, juicy, comfortable grant. So phase 2 of this story is going out and winning contracts, talking to friends, convincing them that it was value for money to use this tool alongside their RCTs and their quasi-experimental methods and their performance monitoring systems as an extra way of gaining a better handle, more confidence on are they achieving what they think they are. And so there's a slight declaration of interest here. I am still an academic. That's my day job at the University of Bath. I'm also director of this company, Bath SDR, which is a non-profit, a social enterprise, which exists to be a sort of constructive, disruptive influence in this space by actually doing studies. And that's what we do. And my role within that is then to reflect on the latest study and see what extra we've learned methodologically as we move forward. So it's a sort of ongoing action research model that we've been pioneering, and it's generated a series of journal outcomes already and a book attributing development impact, which is free on the web. Okay, next slide, please. So what is this QUIP? Firstly, we deliberately set out to rescue the sort of, not rocket science. If you want to find out whether something's working for somebody, ask them. Yeah? Self-reported attribution rather than statistically inferred. Okay. So what we do is we work always with local researchers in any country we're in, including Bristol, which is a long way from Bath, as you know. And they do the interviewing, usually in a local language, and they ask people stories of change. They ask them to give them a narrative account of what's happening in their world, in different domains of well-being. Could be their sex lives, it could be agriculture, it could be education. We frame the conversation around the topics we want to talk about. There's an obvious problem which immediately hit, which is people will tell you what you want to hear. Yeah? So in the experimental phase of this work, we experimented with blindfolding. We asked our researchers in the field to go out and have these conversations about livelihood change and resilience in the face of climate change, without knowing what organization had commissioned them and what organization was being evaluated. So there's a sort of mystery shopping approach to impact evaluation, if you like, the mystery shopper approach. That raises all kinds of practical questions, which we've now got 7 or 8 years of experience trying to tackle, and we've not always been able to blindfold perfectly, but we've always been able to do some degree of blindfolding to address the confirmation bias problem. So that was the first challenge. Secondly, narrative data, you generate lots and lots of text. Well, fortunately, we live in the digital age. What we do is we digitize that text, and we have a program called Causal Map through which we code any statement in text which establishes a causal claim between a driver and an outcome. So we collect causal nuggets, if you like. And once we've coded it, we can turn it into causal maps, which are visual statements of what people think is happening to them. And we can aggregate those maps, as I'll show you, for different people. And why are we doing that? Sometimes it's exploratory. What is going on in this space? Sometimes it's confirmatory. We think we're doing this. We want to confirm that indeed Diageo's purchasing of malt barley in Ethiopia is making a difference to farmers in RC districts. So sometimes it's confirmatory, sometimes it's purely exploratory, and we can do both with the same study. And I won't go into great detail about case selection, but that's another of the issues that we've confronted. We're not collecting statistically representative evidence of what people are experiencing. What we're doing, if you like, is much closer to a sort of Bayesian approach. We're using the time and money we've got to most effect to collect additional evidence on the most interesting cases that challenge the prior theories that we have. That's the broad approach to case selection that we adopt. Let me rush forward to just show you what this all looks like. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So, okay, we've progressed from livelihood change. We've now worked in 50 countries with we've done more than 50 studies in 20 countries, and we've moved into the impact investing field, which is what brings me here. Okay, next slide. We operate in this awkward space. We recognize organizations are good at performance management, or we hope they are. We hope they're good at measuring change. We hope there's relevant evidence in the research field, there's good theory, but we operate in this mid-range theory space, testing the mid-range theories that organizations have about what they think they're trying to achieve. So Habitat for Humanity, for example, believes that there is a social case for commercial access to credit to do incremental improvement in slums. They wanted us to test that mid-range theory, that theory of change, through talking to some of their clients, carefully selected to challenge the prior theory they had. Okay, next slide. Keep going. Oh no, back again twice. Okay, there we go. So this is what it looks like. We have text on the left. Our analysts go through it. They pick out the causal claims. They turn that into logic. And once we've got a data set of causal claims that this seed is resulted in this improvement in yields, then we can aggregate it across the interviews. We can look at what the causal claims women were making or men were making in one district or another district, depending on how many people we've interviewed. We can tag that causal claim as consistent with what the organization thought before, according to theory change or not. And we can add sentiment labels about whether is this positive news or is this negative news. So we're turning qual into quant in order to draw pictures. And I've got very limited time. So here's a picture. That's what it looks like. That is a genuine causal map produced through this work from 48, I think, interviews. The numbers show the number of coded causal claims making each link. You see it's broadly from, this is an integrated microcredit and an extension program in livelihoods. There are feedback loops. The arrows are thicker where we've got more evidence. It's qualitative. We're doing something heretical here. We're turning text into numbers. But in real time, you can hover over these arrows and find the text that was coded. So you know what you're getting. It's very transparent. And that's been our challenge over the course of doing this work. I'm going to finish with one more slide because I'm nearly over 10 minutes. So this is the ongoing work. We're still experimenting with blindfolding, with addressing the confirmation bias problem in the field with our research collaborators in the 20 countries we now have links with. We're still continuing to work on how we make transparent the way of turning the raw text data, narrative data, into diagrams in a way that you can audit. You can work back and find out why has that conclusion come out of it, that this mental model that we had is not what we share with our intended beneficiaries. Thirdly, we're continuing to work on the cherry picking problem, transparent case selection, so that our commissioners and stakeholders are convinced that we haven't just gone out and chosen the cases which we think will corroborate or refute their story. We look for the anomalous cases, the ones that are going to challenge the story they think they've got to tell. And then lastly, and what I'm working on particularly at the moment, is the so-called redocking problem, which is how do you re-embed these kinds of findings into organizations that have commissioned them. It can be very awkward if you're stuck in the middle. You know, you've got a board who are making wildly ambitious claims about your impact. You're working in an extremely complex environment with many actors, and you're the person in the middle trying to substantiate, live with those claims in the face of the reality. So when somebody comes along and generates some quantitative evidence that actually it isn't quite what you think it is, it can be very awkward. So the politics of how we embed ourselves in the organization, how we pass the baton of the evidence back, is absolutely critical to all of this. So we're doing interviews with commissioners about what did they actually learn? What did they do with the information, which is in itself an extremely difficult causal problem. So I'm just going to end with Stiglitz. He said, you know, you've got to measure what matters to you. Well, I just want to challenge the word measure. Most of the time we make decisions in life without measuring precisely in numbers. Measure for me means evidence, and evidence is often qualitative. If you like, there's a legal kind of view of this, of how we got good enough evidence to proceed with what we're doing. And that's why I think we need more qual alongside the quantitative measurement of change.
Thank you very much, James, for this very stimulating presentation. I'm not sure I agree totally with you, but we can discuss with this at the end of the presentation. We will move to the next presentation. So we've got 3 papers that are now dealing with practical tools to measure quantitative impact of quantitative social impact. So we will move to the first presentation, that is Lavinia Pastore. Lavinia, are you online? Yes.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. The paper that I'm presenting to you concerns actually a systematic literature review, most known social impact measurement tool, the SROI, the social return on investment model. Can I change the slide? No. Okay. Can you switch the slide? Okay, thank you. So this research actually comes from a previous research that we presented as a research group 2 years ago, I think, in this conference, in which we were wondering how many measurement tools were around, what was recognized as a measurement tool, not only quantitative, but also qualitative. And we mapped 98 social impact assessment methods or tools, because also in this there is a lot of semantic issue on the field. And then after this first, let's say, research, we decided to focus on the social return on investment, since it was one of the most used. So we wanted to understand more, how does it work, who is using it, and at what point is this tool in its development, okay? So we can change the slide. So we decided to do an academic review. First of all, of course, we studied and we included a lot of books and gray literature that was at the foundation of this tool, of this method. And then we consider other literature reviews that were made about the social return on investment. And we found out that actually there was a gap in literature, because there were some already reviews, but very focused on specific issues or specific sectors. So we decided to go forward with this research, and we applied the PRISMA methodology. So you can change slide, in which we have decided to focus on the social return on investment from an academic point of view. We wanted to understand which was the debate going around, who was writing about it, and which were the main debates and tension within, around this methodology. So we decided to look for academic papers. So we decided not to include, for instance, books or gray literature, even if, as I told you, some of them were already at the very beginning of this research idea. Then we decided to focus on papers, and we explored four academic databases: Web of Science, Scopus, JSTOR, and EBSCO. And of course, the first data set was quite big, almost 600 articles. Then, of course, we had to remove duplicates. We had to add some additional papers. And then we had to set 6 criteria to decide if those papers were actually feasible for our study. So this is, I am describing to you the PRISMA methodology. And of course, we had to focus on the publication status, the topic, the year of publication. So we analyzed those papers, and out of it, we had to take off 77 papers. And in the end, our final data set was of 284 paper. And so what I'm going to present you from this point on is based on this data set. And the results that I'm going to show you are preliminary, because we are still working on the data set. So for me, it's very important also to share with you today which are the early findings, and to have some insights from your point of view to get forward with this feature research. We can change slide. So first of all, a descriptive data. How is the academic evolution around the SROI? As you can see, there was a growing interest, and the peak year is 2015, and then with 48 articles, and then it keeps growing aside from 2016. And what is interesting is that the 25% of our articles are focused on health sector. Now we are going back to the papers, but we think that one of the reasons is that maybe because in this sector, the financial proxies are more useful, are more easy to find, and it is somehow more, there is more data and more opportunity to create financial proxies that are reliable. And this is why the 25% of the articles focus on this sector. This is just an hypothesis. And then there are, of course, research that comes from any kind of areas. Here you find just some examples, but it is very, there is a lot of variety. We can change slide. Here you find a map of the where those articles were written. Of course, UK is the main country. This is why also for us it's very interesting to present this research in this conference, because 73 articles came from UK. It is also important to notice that 53 were not related to a specific country, to a specific country. Some of them were purely theoretical articles, and some of them were like around 37 of those 50, and the remaining ones, they were papers that were dealing with different countries, or where it was not possible to identify the area in which they were problematizing about the social return on investment. Then here in a table, you find also the description of the different qualitative methods, if those papers were qualitative, quantitative, or mixed. And then what is more interesting, you find how those authors were approaching the topic, and if they were optimistic or cautionary. Most of them, as you can see, were optimistic about how this tool and methodology might develop and which are the potentiality. So we can change slide. And I will now present you what we focus on until now. That is the study of which are the limitations or the problems that were found, that those authors were telling about the usage of the social return on investment. And we have clusterized those limitations in two sets. One is related to the high subjectivity of the choice of the financial proxies. This is one of the main issues that goes and goes. That, of course, it can also be expressed as the lack of standardization, the fact of this very the fact that it's very difficult to have a clear cut of what we are looking at. So this is the very first set of limitation. Of course, we have found this kind of limitation also in those authors that have optimistic approach. For sure, there were more arguments in those authors that had a cautionary approach. But if we change the slide, we can see that some authors also suggested how we can go from those limitations and try to improve and overcome them. So we can change slide.
Lavinia, you've got 2 minutes to conclude.
Yes, thank you. So, for instance, here you find just very few examples of authors that have written how they think that they might overcome those sets of limitations that is mainly related to the lack of standardization and subjectivity of the choice of the proxies. So here there are some insights, and the trend is about going, the recommendation is to create a systematic way or not, or to consider always the context. or to move to a normative approach. So there are different kind of solutions. All authors agree that, of course, this is an obstacle that can be reduced, but never completely overcome. The point is that maybe it is not important to overcome it fully, okay? So we can move to the second set of limitation. The other one is about the lack of resources, both from the government side and both from the side of organization that should implement and should do the social return on investment analysis. So this is, of course, the issue that is related to cost and time and how they are in proportion. Okay, so this was something that was very stressed out and highlighted in the papers that came from social enterprises field of studies, let's say. So we can change the slide. And of course, also in this case, we find some kind of solution. Of course, the idea of having more and more training courses and this kind of activities to find, to create a culture around it, but also the idea that maybe this kind of methodology, as well as other social impact assessment methodology, should not be applied if the project or the scale of the project or the organization is very small. So to be very clear on what can be the object actually of this kind of measurement. And the last slide is about the conclusion of this research. As I was telling you, we are actually still studying the database. We are seeing emerging patterns about how those authors are actually considering the social return on investment, but maybe this can be true also for almost monetization social impact methodologies, but this is still an hypothesis. So one point is that they see the social return on investment as a legitimation tool concerning the financial role and the financial legitimacy that might create. Then there is a second pattern related to strengthening, being a strengthening tool, relating it to the relationship with stakeholders. So maybe if we think back to the first presentation, the way in which going up with a process of social impact assessment can create relationship and strengthening the relationship with the stakeholder of the community that is invested by the project. And then, of course, the last one is managerial and communication tool without a specific stakeholder or public, okay? So directly a tool that might help to understand better the social value created by the organization or by the program, but without a specific meaning, let's say. So these are the preliminary results of this research. Thank you for your time. I realized that I didn't present myself in this. So I'm Lavinia Pastore from the University of Rome Tor Vergata and co-founder of a research spin-off called Open Impact that deals actually with the measurement system.
Thank you very much for this complete state of the art concerning social return on investment models. You point out several limitations. I believe that the two next speakers believe that the limitations are quite high because they proposed some other tools to measure the impact. So we will move to the two last presentations. The first one will be given by Joy Maiketh, founding director of Triangle. Joy, the floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to GoLab for giving us this opportunity to share with you some of our learning from 20 years of helping organisations to measure outcomes, mostly relating to individual change. So next slide, please. So quite a lot of the presentations across the conference have come from a kind of a investor or commissioner point of view, which kind of looks down at the whole field and takes an overview. Next slide, please. And what I'm going to be doing is kind of looking a little bit more from the bottom up, the kind of the service provider and the service user eye view when it comes to measuring outcomes. Next slide. So as I was saying, 20 years, myself and Triangle have been supporting organisations to measure outcomes. We've been involved in some national projects, such as writing the guidance, the original guidance for the big lottery for applicants on how to measure outcomes, and contributing to the outcomes framework for the National Supporting People programme in the UK. Next slide, please. And yeah, 4 clicks, please. But by far the biggest piece of experience that I'm going to be drawing on here is our work creating a tool called the Outcome Star, for which there are now 44 versions and which is very widely used in the UK, also in Australia, and with some use around the world in about 20 other countries. So the Outcome Star is a tool that supports service providers to take an enabling approach with service users, and that supports learning at all different levels of the service delivery system. So I'm going to kind of draw on this to talk about the different motives or the different purposes for measurement, and how these can be in harmony, and how they can also kind of pull in different directions when designing a tool, and also when using a tool in practice. So next slide, please, and 4 clicks. So yes, when it, one more, yeah, lovely. So when it comes to measurement, the 2 purposes that get talked about quite a lot are proving accountability to funders, yes, we achieved these outcomes you asked us for, but also improving, so supporting the actual service to kind of to learn what's working, what's not working, how can we adjust things so that we achieve more of the outcomes we're trying to achieve. But I would also argue that on the improving side, there's another aspect that maybe doesn't receive quite so much attention, which is that measuring outcomes can actually also support the service user themselves and support their learning in achieving the goals that they want to achieve. So I'll go on and look at how the Outcome Star contributes to those different objectives. The Outcome Star, the focus is on improving. So it's primarily a tool which is about enabling service users and enabling service providers to learn and to improve their outcomes, but it is also used improving. And I suppose a core part of my case is that actually the gold, the outcomes measurement gold, comes in the improving, because that's where it's at the service delivery level that outcomes are created. So anything that, whereas at the accountability level is important, but measuring for accountability doesn't necessarily improve outcomes in the same way. So next slide. So this is just looking at, this is the Outcome Star. This is what it looks like. It can, this particular version is the one that's for working with parents. This is working with parents where there are concerns that maybe they're not meeting all of the needs of their children. And it consists of 10 outcome areas, a 10-point scale for each outcome area, and it's arranged in the shape of a star like this. So how it's used is the person helping and the person being helped will have a conversation about each outcome area. They'll agree together where the person is on each scale. They'll plot all those different readings on the star, and you can see here, this is a star that's been completed. And how we find that this helps service user learning for the improvement aim is that it really helps the service user to conceptualize their life, their situation, what's working well, what are the challenges, what are their priorities, and what's the next step for them. And if I have just another click, I don't know how clearly you can see that, but it's also designed to be used a second time, and you can plot the scores again, and that gives a very intuitive and visual picture of how much has changed. And that also supports the service user to learn about what's working and what they're doing and what's not, and builds motivation as well to keep going on that change process. So that's how the star supports service user learning. When it comes to service learning, all of those stars can be aggregated and reports produced in various ways, and this is one of them, which enables the service to look at where are we supporting people, where are people making progress, where are they not making as much progress as we'd hoped, why might that be, what can we do to change that, and then monitoring that over time. And if we look at the next slide, and the STAR data is also used quite frequently in reporting to funders and commissioners, and it can be summarised in a much higher level way, where we just look at whether a particular outcome has been achieved. So here, in terms of the parents' behaviour in looking after the physical health of their children, you can report that 38% who were not doing that are now looking after the health of their children in a satisfactory way with continued support. So those are some of the different ways in which ways in which the STAR supports those different purposes of measuring. And I'm now kind of going to look at how those purposes sometimes work in harmony and sometimes are in tension. So one of the ways in which they work in harmony, or a benefit of having a tool that meets the needs of different stakeholders or has different purposes, is that we find that there often can be quite a big gap between the sorts of things that people are thinking about and focusing on at the front line in service delivery and what people are thinking about and talking about in terms of kind of commissioning. So on the one hand, at the front line, say in an offender service, people might be, the conversations might be about how can we support this person who's coming out of prison to re-engage with their family so they've got a supportive family network. How can we help them build their kind of belief that yes, they could get a job and a different kind of way of life is possible. That's the sort of thing that's happening at the frontline conversation, but the commissioner is maybe looking at what's the reoffending rate, what's it costing us, to reduce that reoffending rate. So there can be a bit of a gap of understanding, and having a tool that's used throughout those levels can help to build a shared language, and particularly can help to make visible at the commissioner level, kind of help to raise the bonnet and kind of look at what's actually happening under the bonnet, how are these outcomes achieved. Next slide, please. So yes, it can kind of act as a kind of golden thread linking together the different stakeholders. Next slide, please. And another way in which these purposes we find are in harmony is that in the outcome star, we break change down in each of those outcome areas into quite a number of different steps, which are represented graphically here. And if we have the next slide, that also shows how those steps are kind of represented for a particular outcome area in terms of wording the sorts of behaviours that are seen at different levels of the scale. This serves the service user learning purpose because it really helps the service user to locate where they are in a change process and to think about what the next step is for them. But it also serves the proving aspect because it helps to create a measurement tool that's quite sensitive and that picks up small changes that happen, and often we find that within funding program timescales, maybe the end outcome isn't achieved, but progress is made on the way, and this approach picks that up. Next slide, please. But we do also find that there are ways in which these different purposes are in tension. So here we have the Family Star Plus again, and as you can see, there are 10 outcome areas here. We don't ever create a star with more than 10 outcome areas because we find that if we identify more outcome areas than 10, it becomes very cumbersome in terms of its use for service user learning in that kind of key work frontline engagement. It starts to become a tool that's a burden rather than a benefit. But what that means in terms of the proving side of things is that sometimes we're putting different outcome areas together. So here we have one of the spokes is home and money. So we've put home and money on the same scale, and that makes it less accurate in terms of measurement. So that's an example of how these different purposes can pull against each other. And I was very interested in the panel discussion yesterday after the keynote presentation that people were talking about with wellbeing measures, how to get a really accurate, comprehensive wellbeing measure, you could end up with something that was actually quite difficult to communicate to others and share and use to change behavior. So I think that's another example of this tension that we have. The next slide, please. So I'm going to finish with two propositions. One is that we need a more rounded approach to the validation of measurement tools. So when measurement tools are validated, they usually focus on that kind of proving side of things. How accurate is it? How reliable is it? And obviously those things are really important in a measurement tool. But what they don't do, they often are quite blind to the improving aspect. They don't look so much at how much this tool supports the collection of regular management information that will help in service learning. And they don't look so much at how much the tool supports the service user to learn and actually achieve their outcomes. The next slide, please. So if I was to ask you which is the best of these two cars, you would probably, hopefully say to me, well, it depends. What do you want? You know, if I want to go on a camping holiday with my family, then I'll probably go for the one on the left. If I want to break the land speed record, then I'm going to choose the one on the right. And I think it's the same with outcomes tools. It depends what is a good tool, depends on what you're trying to achieve with that tool. And I think that our approaches to assessing tools need to become more sophisticated and take that into account. So next slide, please. So proving and improving, we have found, can also be in tension in practice. So commissioners ask service providers to measure outcomes, and that certainly focuses the service provider's mind, and they will measure outcomes. But what we found is that they measure outcomes because they need to, because they have to report, they need to do it to sustain their funding. They tend not to use that information for their own learning and development and improvement. So my sort of second proposition to you is that we need to think more, particularly commissioners need to think more about learning-based accountability rather than outcomes-based accountability. So what you're doing is you're requiring that the service provider measure their outcomes, and you're asking them to be accountable for learning and to demonstrate to you that they have learned from that measurement, and to demonstrate that they're feeding that learning into ongoing improvement. And the reason that I'm arguing for that is because that's actually what's going to improve the outcomes. It's all very well to prove them, but if the proving isn't improving, then it's not achieving as what it potentially could. And final slide. So yeah, that's just a sort of bit of a taste of the learning that we've been drawing from our 18 years working on the Outcomes Star, which has effectively been an 18-year kind of action research project. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll be publishing a report, Enabling Help, which shares more of that learning. So just to encourage you to get in touch so that we can share that report with you.
Thank you very much. Right on time. You respect the timing. Let's move to the last presentation. I'm very excited about the title, at least, because we will talk about SDGs. So we are talking about social outcomes and which indicators should we focus on, but we've got the SDGs. So maybe we should start by this to try to develop some tools. So this is exactly what Anna Pimenta will present us right now. This is the last presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I am the Impact Manager of Social Capital Foundation and Blink, two sister organizations dedicated to impact investing and venture philanthropy. And I'm also finishing my PhD in impact measurement from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. And this presentation is about how we can improve social outcomes through impact measurement, which is part of my PhD research. So next slide. Yeah. Impact measurement is key to develop and fund outcome-based contracts. At the same time, there is a huge diversity of frameworks to do it, and there is not a generally accepted one. This leads to confusion, misleading opportunities, lack of rigor, and of course, lack of sophistication. Reviewing several articles, doing the literature review, I concluded that does not seem to exist a unique framework. And worse than that is that none seems to accomplish 6 key characteristics for a robust framework. So comparability is not achieved for many of them. Accountability, which means avoiding personal opinions and judgments. Completeness, this means respecting a theory of change. Simplicity, or being cost effective. Having an objective for optimum performance and efficiency. And finally, impact risk. Next slide. Yes, so at the same time, impact investors seem to be really interested in aligning their strategies with the SDGs, particularly due to its universality and transparency. To assess where each country stands against the SDGs, in 2016 was created the SDG Index, where 115 indicators were included for OECD countries. This index offers three really important things. One is standard indicators. Another one is a uniform measurement unit. And the third one is boundaries, so maximums and minimums. Next slide, please. So how it works. So each country's score is based on the arithmetic average of the 17 goals. To calculate each goal score, several indicators are considered and equally weighted. Here you can see an example for SDG 4, quality education, for Portugal in 2020, which is the final score was 70.6. Next slide. Okay, so the research question here is how we can use the SDGs to measure and evaluate impact. Next, yeah. So this is a new proposal, which I call the SDG Index Plus, which use the traditional SDG index, as I briefly explained, but transforms the output and the outcome, or one or another, into units of SDG. This allows to assess all benefits, so the contribution, in relation to the costs, the investment. Next slide. So how it works. Imagine the hypothetical situation of a 5 million investment to help 10,000 women finishing their lower secondary education. Here we'll consider Germany, for example, but just as an example. And this indicator is part of SDG 4. So on the left side of the graph, you can see that the upper and the lower and the official score for Germany, in this case for 2020, are already fixed by the SDG index, okay? So next slide. Yeah. So this is the tricky part. So after this, we have to translate these scores into the same language as the outputs target. In this case, it is defined as the population at the entrance age for the last grade of lower secondary education, which is approximately 15 years old. So the upper number on the right side, the 795,722, represents the total number of people with age 15 in Germany. So if you have 100% of people finishing the lower secondary completion rate in Germany, we'll have 795,722. We can use a rule of three to calculate the current target and the lower target. And finally, what we need to do? We need to calculate what would have happened if our investment didn't occur. So we subtract the 10,000 women to the current target. Next slide. So now we have both situations, the situation with our investment and the situation without our investment. If we normalize these two situations, okay, so from 0 to 100, and the difference between them represents the investment's contribution in units of SDG, which can be compared independently of the indicator or the goal. So in this case, we have 1.5326 units of SDG is the contribution to this particular indicator in Germany. If we divide this number by the 9 available indicators for SDG 4, we'll have 0.1703, which is the contribution to SDG 4 in Germany. And if we divide this by 17 goals, we have 0.0100 units of SDG, which is the contribution to the SDG of Germany. Finally, if we divide this, or if we consider the weight of Germany to the world, okay, because not all countries represent the same for the world, we get 0.0001 units of SDG, which is the contribution of this investment for the world SDG. Next slide, please. And finally, if we divide the 5 million euros investment by these 0.0001 units of SDG, we can say that to generate 1 unit of world SDGs, we'll need 70.4 billion euros. Next slide. So this was applied to 3 real social impact bond projects. I used the Oxford Indigo Impact Bond dataset. This included different areas of intervention, types of beneficiaries, timelines, investment amounts, and countries. Next slide. So 2 main conclusions arise from this analysis. First, higher investment may not result in higher impact returns, which can be seen here as, for example, case 1 has a higher investment amount, but case 2 has higher impact returns. Next slide, please. And another conclusion is that higher outputs or outcomes may not result in higher impact returns either. So we can see here that case 3 has a higher output or outcome. In this case, it was an outcome, but both case 1 and case 2 have better impact returns. Next slide, please. A couple of conclusions. First, higher investments may not result. The SDGs can be adapted to measure impact for outcome-based contracts in a quantitative way, and that can be compared between different contracts. At the same time, this framework satisfies all the 6 key attributes we discussed. So comparability, accountability, completeness, simplicity, optimal, and impact risk. Main contributions to finalize this presentation. I think this study helped to advance the impact measurement for the impact investing field in academia. It also demonstrates that we can improve the way impact investors measure and manage their impact in a comparable way. And also very important to demonstrate that monetization is not only a way that we can use to measure impact in a way that is comparable and quantitative. So you can use different ways of quantifying impacts. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the end of presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation. So this is the end of the session. So now we've got time to take some questions, maybe to pick up some questions that has been put in the chat part of the Zoom. Georgina, you are here now. So you've got time also to present yourself, because I started by saying very bad things about you at the very beginning of the session.
That is fair. I deserve that, Stefan. Thank you. Yes, how about we open to questions, and then I can attempt to do all those wonderful, rich presentations justice in a summary. So if we have any questions from the floor, otherwise I can pull some out of the chat.
The floor. Everybody already had the questions, the chat part. Maybe I can just start by having a reaction about the session. So as I told you at the beginning, I'm not an expert of those issues. I'm an expert of public procurement, broadly defined infrastructures contracts, and so on. Not obviously about social outcome-based contracts, and many things just came as a surprise for me. First of all, the choice of social performance measures that would be used. I mean, in my world, public procurement, infrastructures, investment, and so on, I mean, the commissioner is deciding about the performance measure, and you are not deciding or discussing about stakeholders. We need to discuss about stakeholders for them to agree about the different measures and so on, as we heard during the first presentation. So it comes as a surprise for me. Also, what I was surprised about, it does not come as a surprise because I know that, but is the way performance are evaluated. Do we use baseline performance, or do we use control groups, counterfactuals, and so on? It's an open question. It's very costly to do that. And also the compliance issue. Who is controlling this? So you've got plenty of third parties that are involved in the project to be able to collect data and to control for the performance, because basically the commissioner do not have the capacities to control by itself directly. So my main comment would be that it's a lot of transaction costs, huge transaction costs in those projects. Very often when we are talking about social impact bonds, we are talking about small projects, small amount projects. So high transaction cost, small projects does not fit well together. And maybe the future of social outcome-based contract is in big projects with infrastructures, with investment, where you've got huge amount and you can afford for transaction cost and very complex measure and very complex way to follow performance. I don't know. But as I said, I'm not an expert. I was waiting for Georgina at the beginning, and I said she was more expert compared to me. So you want to react?
Yes, I'd like to react to that point, actually. So I'll express an interest because I'm work with Joy, so I'm part of Triangle. I think what you say is very interesting, and it struck me with some of these presentations that point exactly, that the scale of these investments, there is a lot of work involved in getting the outcomes measures right. But I do think also that it's really, really important to get those outcomes measures right. Otherwise, you're investing. It doesn't really matter how much you're investing. If you're investing to not to achieve the outcomes you're trying to achieve, then you're wasting your money. So I'm not sure that that's quite correct. But I think the other point is that a lot of public spending goes into things that we need to spend on anyway, whether that's health, education, social services. And a lot of what we're talking about is finding ways to see if that kind of spending, which can be low level, medium level, or very high level, but is it achieving the outcomes it's trying to achieve? And that's what I think these tools are needed for.
And obviously the outcome star tool can be used for many projects. Georgina, you want to open?
Thanks, Stefan. Yes, I might pull some of the questions coming from the chat. So we have a wonderful one from Nandita Das, and this could probably be to everyone, but particularly some of the tools like Joy's and Dr. Anna Good, who are trying to reconcile different stakeholders in the group. So the question is, I'm interested in understanding how to ensure measurement is meaningful, particularly how do you measure power imbalances or reconcile power imbalances? So do any of our speakers want to take that question?
Who is taking the question?
Well, I mean, I could start, or I could just make a start from the outcome star perspective, which also relates to the kind of the cost of doing all this measurement. What we found is, because we work in different sectors, such as say mental health, or work with older people, or work with parents, as I was mentioning in my presentation. And what we have found working with a range of different organisations in one sector is that often the meaningful outcomes are very similar across different service providers, and there's a lot of consistency. And what that means is that we can create tools. We create tools with a kind of in collaboration with service providers and service users. But having created the tool, they're then picked up. We offer them and they're picked up by lots of other organizations in that sector. And that means that you can kind of invest once in developing the tool and then it can be rolled out many times. And then in terms of making sure that the outcomes that you're identifying and the way that you're measuring them is meaningful, we have a process which usually takes about a year to 18 months, in which we have literature review, interviews, workshops, drafting, feeding back, piloting, feeding back. So it's a very iterative process in which it's kind of tested and retested and honed to try and create something that is meaningful to service users and frontline workers. I mean, in terms of power and balance, I'm not, well, maybe I should stop there. And
okay, a quick comment on that, but first, just to agree very strongly that with the point about different measures and evaluability. You know, the presentations, you know, have reflected a wide diversity of contexts and scales, and so we do have to be careful, and time horizons. So, you know, that came through in the chat, and I'd really like to acknowledge that. You know, often we're looking at the right investment in finding out better what's going on for the right purpose in a very specific context, and often it's a mixture of sources of information we get. So I think it's really important to always hold that in mind. The context within which I've been working are ones where there are quite long chains of financing, aid hierarchies or investment hierarchies. So we have major principal agent problems between commissioners and those who they are claiming to help with other people's money, if not their own. And so we're very conscious that the work we do is embedded in those kinds of power structures. And to some extent, our own values are about ensuring that the voice of key stakeholders that often get neglected or are often only present in indicators that other people have chosen on their behalf to privilege in decision-making processes, that those people get a voice in these processes. So it's very explicitly about power, and the research, as we've continued, has moved from being more technical to how we embed the information we collect in the decision processes of organizations. So in a way, every evaluative investment is an investment in a deliberative process, which hinges on the commissioner or other stakeholders being willing to open up their thinking, to challenge, to suggestions that other people within the sphere they're working have different views. So, you know, a quick point on subjectivity here. We're in the business of promoting intersubjective truth. You know? Physicists only have intersubjective truth. They agree as a peer group about how the universe is constructed. We're trying to build, consolidate intersubjective truth because people agree within a community of practice. And often intended users, marginalized stakeholders don't get a say in that. And that's where I think these tools come in. But it is always conditional on the willingness and openness of those with the money to listen, to be open to the feedback that they're getting. We only have to think about Afghanistan. It can be very, very cost effective if an organization is open to a reality check early enough on the thinking that underpins what it's doing. And that is clearly a highly political thing. And I think that's what Stiglitz was talking about yesterday. Keeping our measures simple and recognizing the evaluation, the evaluability point again, recognizing where precision in our measurement can be sustained, but not going too far, sticking with the dashboard, not with the mashup. So we very deliberately score the feedback we get so that we can get some handle on how widely different groups have a view about what's driving change in different domains of their lives. But we're very careful not to turn that into an index and to mash up all the different impacts and causal claims they're making across different domains of well-being.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. No, I think that's great that the answers came from the two tools that are are trying to capture the lived experience of people and give a voice to the people actually being impacted and put that in the hands of the people that are funding it. So thank you, Joy and James as well. Should we take another question from the chat or how? Yeah, wonderful. So perhaps a more direct one to Lavinia. Do you think social return on investment is the best way to measure outcomes in social impact bonds? What about the difficulty in attributing a value to intangible outcomes, freedom, hope, education, etc.?
Thank you very much. I was trying to answer to it from the chat, but it's very complex to follow the discussion and answering. And I think this question is also linked to the latest one. Someone wrote about the impossibility of measurement. Maybe it's broader because the first one, of course, is related to the social return on investment that is linked to the usage of financial proxies. That is on one side why this methodology has been used so much, also because it transforms information into something very quick to understand and with a measure that can be understood. And at the same time, this creates a problem of measurement of intangibles, let's say, and what is the value of those intangibles. So going back to the first question about social impact bonds, I don't think that there is one methodology that suits most, because we have seen also in the first presentation or in many other cases of social impact bonds, there is not, I don't think this is a methodology that has to be chosen. Of course, this is more related to what the investor fund wants. So, but I think that there are different methodologies also that might be mixed. I mean, for some outcome areas, maybe it is very useful to use the social return on investment and is feasible. For other outcome areas that are identified in the theory of change of the project or we might use other methodologies as the ones that we have been presented today. So I think also we have to learn how to mix and not to be I want the one methodology and use that one. Of course, the social return on investment, now one of the founders was here in the chat, it's broad because it is clear how to do it. I mean, the steps, but then what is within, so the difficulty of the object of measurement is still difficult as, and we face the same difficulties using other kinds of methodologies. So I don't think that we should reasoning that much about which is the best tool, but how can we adapt and use them according to the situation, to the availability of data. As we know, most of the time, contrafactual is too expensive. The transactional cost is too expensive, so we cannot do it, and so on. So every time, maybe there is, it is very important to stick to the context, and at the same time to build international data, national data, and little by little going forward with this kind of research. So I really thank the conference for being a place where we can talk about this issue and keep studying it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lavinia, and to your colleague Luigi as well, who I see is on the call. So I am getting poked that it is now probably time to wrap up. There are lots of questions, so we'll make sure that all the speakers get a copy of them, and please get in contact with them. So thank you again. Apologies from me. Absolutely no disrespect to the speakers or my co-host or the wonderful hosts at GoLab. I wish I had some exciting excuse that I was fighting off a great white shark or something down here in Australia, but no, it was just a very boring calendar mishap. So I'm really apologetic for that. But thank you to everyone. I think we saw so many key important themes to the integrity and rigor of social impact measurement covered today. So from Leva and her team at the South African Medical Research Council, addressing the important challenges that come with counterfactuals and being able to ascertain contribution. I think they presented a really creative example of how we might be able to overcome this, but also being very flexible and having an iterative approach. So I think that's a wonderful example of what's possible, because it's not always easy to get a control group, or not always possible, and a clear baseline. So we have to look for more creative ways. And then to James at the University of Bath, his continued research into, again, contribution and ascertaining attribution from development and now moving into impact measurement, so important. And again, a key theme of being able to measure that lived experience, and raising the theme as well of cost effectiveness. And then to Lavinia and Luigi from the University of Rome, the theme of valuation, exploring the monetization, and some of the issues that come along with that, but that very that very constructive approach, again, to look at solutions that we don't need to throw out something that has some limitations, but we can look to strengthen it, and it definitely still has place in different use cases. So wonderful with that work. And then Joy and Dr. Anna Good from Triangle, and the Outcome Star tool. Again, very important to be able to represent the needs of the people that are actually being impacted in a way through data, to be able to communicate that to the people that are funding it. So being able to reconcile those different stakeholder perspectives. And also, Joy making that important point that we focus, or so much of impact measurements often on focusing on the prove and putting forward what has been achieved, where we need just as much attention on producing the actionable insights and how can we actually improve on that. And then finally, to Anna, perfect presentation to sum it all up, covering some of those key, or if not the key, I think, principles across impact measurement that this huge proliferation of approaches are trying to address, from comparability to accountability, completeness, simplicity, being able to optimize impact and risk. So, and of course, operationalizing the use of the SDGs. So actually being able to show a meaningful contribution, that's so that we can actually drive towards real change. So really incredible selection of those key themes, and it was just a wonderful, rich session. And also, I think just to note that the work that's being done globally now to try and harmonise all of this and to bring standardisation together. So in the UK, I think they've really led the charge with the standards, the national standard on enhancing social value, and Australia's been quick to follow, although we've had the help of Medi through GoLab as well, with the development of the Standards Australia Measuring Social Value Handybook. So that also carries on that work, and now we're seeing later in the year Sweden's going to start working on a national standard for measuring social value. So I think in these efforts, and to continue to bring integrity to how social impact measurement's done, I encourage you to engage with those three, particularly the Australian that's out for public consultation later in September, and I'm sure that will come out through GoLab as well. So thank you very much for that. And Stefan, is there anything you'd like to add to that summary? Or
Thank you very much, Georgina, for this beautiful wrap-up. Don't worry about this little issue at the beginning of the session. I know that you are collaborating for a long time with the GoLab. We are not very resentful. You may come back in 5 or 6 years. Don't worry. So it's time for me to close the session. Just for the people who are online, just to let you know that we will not close the session for you. You can still interact between you and ask questions and answer to the questions you are asking between you. And on our side, we will have a short break of 45 minutes before to move to a plenary session, a big picture session that will be about making sense of the global evidence on outcomes-based contracting approaches. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you.